My name is Joyce Smith. I'm the Deputy Executive ADA of our Community Relations Division at the DA's office. I'm so excited that you joined us for this overview of what District Attorney Singas has been doing to mobilize and to transform our conversations around violence. And she started that conversation, as many of us did, pinned to a television and watching one of the most tragic events in our nation's history, but unfortunately it's something that's become a little bit too commonplace. So I'm going to share with you a quick video that illustrates that.
Our first response was, that sounded a lot like a gunshot, and we close the door. We tell our teacher she closes the door, and right after she does that, the fire alarm gets pulled.
So right now we're in a school, an active shooter. It's not a drill, and it's currently...
Hello?
It's 2:52.
Where are you right now?
I heard one gunshot, and we thought it was a drill initially, but it's not.
I start going with them. I follow the herd, and it turns out that we were actually running towards the school shooter. And thank God for a janitor stopping us right before we got anywhere near close to the freshman building. He stopped us, and he got us into Chef Kurth with Chef Kurth's help into her classroom. I would say about 30 to 40 students into this teacher's classroom at the same time. And as a result of their heroic actions, they saved probably all of our lives. This is not acceptable. This is something that is completely unacceptable and that we need to take action on. We can say all these great things like condolences and saying we're so sorry for your loss. It is obviously important. But what we need at this point is not to say that anymore, because there shouldn't be any more children that die. We need to.
So District Attorney Singas saw that clip along with many others covering the Parkland shooting in Florida on February 14th. And I know that we heard from Scott Beagle's mom, and we have in this country developed a desensitization to acts of violence generally. But in recent years, I think we can all attest that we've seen a decrease in our shock and our response collectively to mass shootings. And that was the reality that DA Singas was confronted with when she said, we have to do something. She said, I heard what the students said in the news, and we brought together a couple of students from our local high schools to speak with her about what their mobilization looked like. I don't know if you all remember the day of outrage where the students collectively walked out across our country to speak out against gun violence. And when she saw those students mobilized and active and a participant in this conversation in ways they had never been before, she said, I have to do something. She said, I accept their charge. I accept this responsibility. I'm not going to shirk my responsibility anymore as an adult. I'm a caretaker in this community. I'm the district attorney of Nassau County, and it's my responsibility to move forward and take action in this issue. And so, she said, we cannot allow the frequency of mass shootings in America to leave us complacent. These horrific acts of violence could happen here, and we must take every possible preventative step to ensure that educators, parents, mental health professionals, and religious leaders share information regarding possible threats so that law enforcement can diligently investigate them. This task force will bring together stakeholders to tear down communication barriers. Remember that, to tear down communication barriers, and to ensure that Nassau is taking a proactive approach to prevent these senseless crimes. Our district attorney decided that she was going to answer the call of those young people, the call of David Hogg and the other students across this country who said, we need you. We need you to do something about this violence before it happens to us. We're not equipped. We're not elected officials. We're not law enforcement. We're not teachers. We're not counselors. We are the students that you've been hired to protect. We need you to do something. So she decided, as opposed to talking about it, as opposed to sitting in a meeting room behind closed doors in a less than transparent way, she decided to open the conversation to our community at large. And she brought together on March 27th, in 2018, roughly a month and 2 weeks or so after the Parkland shooting, members of the community who had expertise in this area. As we began to form the task force, and she informed me that I was going to have this shared responsibility for chairing it. I said, thanks, boss, but it's a terrifying prospect. Thank you for your confidence. But ultimately, it wasn't the confidence in me that made the difference. It was the confidence that she had in the expertise of the people that she gathered in that room. So at the Morelli Center on March 27th, we brought together the stakeholders, the individuals who know what we need to do about this issue to answer the call of those young people in danger. But the conversation, DA Singas said, cannot be limited only to our students in our schools. It needs to encompass the broader issues that our churches and synagogues face. It needs to encompass the broader issues that hospitals face without security mechanisms and magnetometers. It needs to encompass our malls and our sporting arenas. So she asked all of the individuals responsible for security and for securing those sorts of facilities to come together on a regular basis so that we could meet and discuss our plan. And meeting to discuss a plan with that many experts in the room, I think you can hazard to guess, is not an easy task. A lot of egos, there's a lot of brilliance, there's a lot of intelligence, there's a lot of expertise in one place. You put that in one person, it's a lot to deal with. You put a lot of those people in one place, magic happens. Magic happens. And that's exactly what we saw in the course of our meeting. So, the DA charged us with some very specific responsibilities. We were asked to explore the protocols in place at our schools and colleges and public buildings in Nassau in order to mitigate potential threats. One thing that I've learned since being much more involved here in our Nassau County culture is that we have that sort of bedroom community mindset sometimes where we get comfortable in our cars and in our private spaces. We can go into the public arenas and then go home and be comfortable and feel secure. And the problem with that is that we are not on alert, that we are not always ready, and that we often think it won't happen here. It won't happen here. And that's exactly what the students and the families in Parkland thought. It won't happen here, not in this community. But what we've learned since getting together in the task force is it absolutely can happen here. And we have to be ready for that. We have to be ready for it as though it is an eventuality, as though it is real, as though it is a present danger, because it is. So she also charged us with assessing the support needs of stakeholders to prevent and respond to threats of mass harm. She asked us to develop guidance and recommendations to ensure individuals in crisis get the help they need and the services they need. She asked us to prepare training curricula that regards health and safety exceptions to FERPA and HIPAA, and I'll touch on those in a moment. They are not stop signs to safety, but in many ways they become stumbling blocks to us, and we haven't figured out how to navigate around them. That's what this task force was asked to do. And then ultimately, the DA asked us to issue a public report that will detail our findings and recommendations for her approval and ultimately for Nassau County's adaptation. We don't have a uniform system of responding to these issues in Nassau as we might otherwise hope. Since the task force has started its meetings, we've discovered that that is something that is possible and absolutely achievable. The task force, as I mentioned, is comprised of a wide array of experts whom I've come to regard as friends and colleagues. We've been able to sit together around that conference table over the course of the last now 9 months. And we've been talking every single month about this issue, exclusively focused on what we need to do. We started our work with organizing the task force along areas of expertise. So we developed subcommittees, and the task force was comprised of roughly 50 to 75 individuals that are listed here from every aspect of Nassau County's public service, law enforcement, education, our members of the DA's office who are here that can just raise their hands because you're also members of the task force, and members of the task force who are here as well. We've gotten together for the purpose of making sure that we come up with the best answers to the questions that the DA posed to us, and by extension, the best answers to the questions that those students posed to us. So we've gathered together individuals from the LGBT network, individuals from the Islamic Center of Long Island, the heads of the Nassau and Suffolk School Boards Association, as well as the Superintendents Association. We gathered together teachers and parent-teacher association reps and hospital security directors and college and university security directors and law enforcement from federal, state, and local law enforcement departments, as well as our own DA's office members. And so that composition on its face looks beautiful, like a rug that has beautifully intricate woven patterns and colors, but underneath, the hard work looks exactly what the underside of a rug looks like. The hard work has been challenging. The meeting of the minds has not always been easy. The composition that was necessary as required by this very challenging problem has brought together people with very different views. We have members of Homeland Security from the federal law enforcement agencies, and we have members of the New York Civil Liberties Union who are all in the same room to come up with answers to the same problem. Magic has happened. So having these individuals brought together and broken down according to their areas of expertise was the start. We put together our minds around the tasks of what law enforcement is doing about this issue of threats of mass harm and public safety, what our healthcare providers, our mental health professionals, our school administrators, our clergy, our community leaders are doing about this issue. And then lastly, we broke down a subcommittee of our legislative and policy experts, and those are the attorneys. And how many of us know getting a bunch of attorneys in the room doesn't always mean a nice, easy conversation? We're the attorneys on that subcommittee. Yes, that's the truth. We know too much, that's the problem. We just know too much for our own good. But once we got together and we focused on our subcommittee's tasks, we were able to have a common conversation. So with the task force being brought together around these subcommittees, we started developing the materials and the conversations or the discussions that would make up our final report. We lastly decided, in addition to these individual meetings, we want to present our findings and recommendations to the public, to parents, to students, to everyone who might be affected by what we recommend as best practices. Apologize. So what are some of the issues that we have found in this report as we've started drafting? The first thing that we have started doing is exploring some of the protocols that are in place at Nassau schools and colleges and universities, etc. The biggest challenge when we started to address that first issue, to ask ourselves, what are the existing protocols, was a huge surprise to all of us, but to some of you, maybe not. What do you think our biggest challenge was as we sat down to explore those existing protocols and practices? What's that?
To find out what they were to begin with.
To try and figure out what they were, and that cut across each of those subcommittee lines, law enforcement's best practices and protocols, etc. We also realized that there was no consistency across Nassau County with regard to how we were responding to these issues. From one school district to the next, from one teacher to the next, from one hospital to the next, everyone had a different pattern and practice. There are statewide recommendations that the Department of Education has asked schools to follow, and we're including those recommendations in our report for school administrators to adopt. One of those things is having a systematized way of responding to training requirements, to staff's emergency response, but also to making sure everyone knows what the protocols are, what parents need to understand about this issue, and how they can be guided in preparing their student at home for the important conversations about safety in their schools. So one of the first issues that we were faced with, and I have to write on the board because I teach and it makes me comfortable, so bear with me, was inconsistency in our collective responses. When we realized that we had that level of difference of opinion, and I don't know, what do you guys do? I don't know how we should do this because my school district is much smaller than yours. My school district is horribly underfunded compared with yours. My organization feels differently about reporting mechanisms than yours. Once we realized that there was a difference of opinion as to how we approached the subject matter, we started to pull out centralized themes that were common among every group. The first thing that we recognized, and I think we accepted, is that we want to protect safety, that we want to do so in the most efficient, effective manner, no matter what the discipline or area of expertise, and that we want to do so in a way that the public can engage with, so that the public is now aware of what they can do to protect themselves and to help us better protect them when we hold positions of leadership. So the consistency in our responses was first and foremost. To establish those protocols requires us to come up with the central theme. For law enforcement, we learned that the Nassau County Police Department developed the Rave App. How many of you have heard of the Rave App? Okay, a couple people. So the Rave App enables anyone who is in a public facility, but specifically our schools, to download this application and immediately access help, access law enforcement's response in the shortest time possible by simply pressing a button on their phone. The Rave App has been adopted in 180 schools across Nassau County. We now have hundreds and hundreds of students who have a sort of shield of protection because their educators and administrators are now able to quickly access law enforcement. Our police commissioner, Patrick Ryder, mentioned that we need 3 to 4 minutes to respond to these crises. We don't have time for one sheriff's deputy standing outside communicating with someone over a radio and not knowing where to direct his call for help. We need to have an immediate response, and law enforcement has equipped our schools, but it's also training our members of the faith and members of houses of worship with a training protocol called Caretakers of the Congregation. Our Nassau County Police Department is able to go out and train and provide these trainings throughout congregations, synagogues, mosques. We had a story presented by one of the individuals who serves on our Threat Prevention and Intervention Subcommittee that in the Islamic center where she worships, they had to differentiate between those worshipers who would be responsible for guarding the congregation and sort of keeping watch while the other members of the center were allowed to worship and pray. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen. And so when we recognize that we have mechanisms already in place, we're now going to share that information and make those services available to every member of the public. Another issue that arose was assessing the support needs of stakeholders to prevent and respond to threats of mass harm. In our meetings with school administrators, we heard one recurring theme. What do you think it was? In terms of their needs to respond to these threats, what do you think our school administrators often said they needed? Money. Yeah. Exactly. And so funding mechanisms that can be brought into play here in Nassau County through legislative acts as well as through funding sources and a kind of coalition building that we've seen among members of the task force will better equip our school districts with the ability to simply respond to hiring more guidance counselors who can focus on a student's mental health needs and not their testing performance. With the ability for school administrators to hire either security staff or to put security equipment in place that makes not only the school administrator feel safe, but the students also feel safe and comfortable. Not being able to put that into a school that has over 3,000 students attending on a daily basis is a shame, and it's our shame. So one of the recommendations that the report is going to put forward is making sure that we have adequate funding. The lack of funding will address many, many needs, not just school administrators, but also hospital security, as well as community members who want to see additional security mechanisms in place for either their houses of worship or public gathering spaces. A big issue that we were confronted with was developing guidance and recommendations that would ensure individuals in crisis receive the help they need. Our public facilities, our buildings, our schools, our hospitals, our houses of worship are in desperate need of mental health assistance for their congregants, for their students, and for their participants. We recognize that underlying Adam Lanza and virtually every other school shooter is a cry for mental health assistance. There is typically a thread that runs through each and every shooting, every threat of mass harm that centers in on the issue of mental health. And without supporting those mental health service providers, we are ignoring the problem and not reaching an adequate solution. So the Mental Health Association of Nassau County is one of our participants, one of our task force members, and they've come up with the mental health first aid training. The protocol is going to be published and made available in our report. They are available to go out, along with many of the other partners that participate in the task force. They're able to go out to any school, anyone that requests this first aid training, for administrators, for staff members, for parents, for PTA associations. Anyone who asks for this training can receive it free of charge. So the challenge for us is not to ignore the issue of mental health and not to ignore the fact that it oftentimes is the catalyst that leads to the tragic event. Now that we realize and have accepted that as truth, we're prepared to respond to it in a really cohesive and concerted way. One of the biggest challenges that we faced, and this is where I'm going to call on some assistance from some of the task force members who are here, was to prepare a training curriculum regarding the health and safety exceptions to the laws that protect our privacy. Laws that protect our privacy, like FERPA and HIPAA, that are designed to make sure that our private documents are not made public without our permission, will oftentimes create a huge source of confusion for service providers, for school administrators, for teachers, for hospital workers to figure out, I know this person is in crisis and is in need, but I can't share it with anyone because it's held in confidence. There are exceptions to that rule. And one of the exceptions that we need to make clear and that we intend to train members of the public and administrators and leaders on is public safety. And when there is a crisis or a so-called red flag that's attached to public safety, it requires us to find and to release and share information that would have otherwise been held private. So, Melissa, I hate to call it, but if you would, just kind of share a bit with the folks who are present what we've kind of been discussing in the Legislative and Policy Subcommittee about that.
Sure. So I was very pleased to be on the subcommittee, but I was pretty new to all of it. So I was learning about it as we went along. So as a prosecutor, and I don't have children, so I had a unique perspective on it. As a prosecutor, I thought, well, we're going to share information. That seems logical. The police are there to help us. We want to share. But what I quickly learned was that all of these restrictions make it, the teachers are fearful of sharing. They're afraid of being sued. And there are a lot of, not just the legal aspect, but there are some human concerns, such as stigmatizing children, labeling them. So when we say, and I'm so quick to say, well, there's a red flag, we should notify, we have to do something, we have to share the information. But what is the effect on the child long term? And that was something that I had to grapple with and that I learned about. And so it's a real concern. So we're balancing the safety of all the students with the privacy rights, as well as the stigma that may become attached, where if you have a child that is on the border of crisis, are we making it worse? Are we pushing them into that crisis mode? Are we going to cause, it's not that we're causing them to do it, but by stigmatizing them, are they more ostracized now? Are children then going to label them and bully them even more than how they had been labeled? So there's a huge balancing act that really needs to be done, and so it's much more intricate, I think, than many of us think about initially. We all say, well, yes, we want red flags and we want to notify and we want to communicate, but you have to kind of put the brakes on and think about the federal laws that have been enacted to protect the privacy rights, and you have to think about the mental health of the child that might be in crisis.
Right. Good. Well said. One of the other challenges that we found in the law enforcement arena was that we had inadequate legislation or perhaps clumsy legislation, I'll say, with regard to making terroristic threats generally that came out of our nationwide response to September 11th. But we found here in Nassau County that that didn't always, on the ground of our daily criminal court engagement, answer the challenges with a young student who might have made some, not necessarily veiled threat, maybe an open threat, towards a school or towards the general public in that school building. And now we are arresting that young person for a felony. And now we have a felony charge that may not be properly suited, or the language of the charge may not be properly suited to address the issue that occurred with the student. So one of the proposed pieces of legislation was the threats of mass harm, and thanks to Melissa, if you just also kind of summarize what the subcommittee has proposed as to that and some of the conversations about that.
Sure. So I tried a case this year with another assistant where there was a threat made to a congregation, to a church, and it was a Pentecostal organization where they had their meetings in a commercial building, and there are two parts to a Pentecostal celebration. There's the worship, and then there's the community portion, which is downstairs. They share food and they discuss, and that's what they do. That's their idea of worship. But the current legislation doesn't envision something like that. That is not a church. It is not worship the way it was originally written. And then what is, I'm going to, because I wasn't thinking I was going to do this, there's a specific, I forgot what the statute says, but it basically says something like a group of people. And so when it's not defined, what is a group of people? Are we a group of people? Is a Pentecostal organization, do they not deserve the same designation as a Catholic church where everybody would recognize that's a church? And that didn't seem right. And so the jury struggled with it because there was no definition, and they were right. How do we say that this is what the law contemplated? It's a felony charge. The jurors know that they're in county court, perhaps convicting someone of a felony, but the legislature hasn't given the tools that we need to hold people responsible for these horrific crimes. This person came in and threatened to shoot people, made the motion of a gun, left, and then came back. Thereby thinking, everyone thought he was actually going to shoot them, and we didn't have the tools that were needed. So after that case, our office proposed legislation together with other members, and hopefully it eventually gets passed, where there's some guidance, some appropriate definitions that aren't overly broad, which I think is what the statute currently is, but also aren't so narrow that we're boxing out communities that should appropriately be protected.
Exactly. And communities being protected means we have in place the protocols, we have in place the support for their needs and for the students or the individual's need, and we also are all aware of the signs and symptoms that might lead to a tragic event. So with these issues being presented to our task force, inconsistency in county-wide responses, lack of necessary funding to supplement and to support the services that are in place.
Hey, could you back up a moment? Of course, still a little confused about what she's saying. You're talking about what constitutes proposing legislation to determine what constitutes a group.
Let me back
up.
I might not have been clear about it. There is a statute that's currently in the penal law called making a terroristic threat. Mm-hmm. So there has to be an act, and it has to be made to a group of people. Right. And again, I'm not being articulate about this, but a group of people wasn't defined. Right. So what is a group of people? Is it people at a movie theater? I mean, we've seen, unfortunately, that happen. Is it a group of children in a school? We've seen that happen too. Is it a religious gathering? Well, what's a religious gathering? And so in this case, this Pentecostal community, the portion of the threat, that was really the crux of the case, occurred during their community portion, which is in the basement where they share food and they discuss
part of their religious service.
That's right. Well, I mean, my humble opinion it is, But the legislature didn't include that, so the argument by the defense was this was not the group that was contemplated under the law. And we said, well, I don't think the law is clear. I don't know what group was contemplated under the law because it really doesn't say. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who makes, like Joyce was saying, a veil threat, who shouts something would fit into this category. It doesn't mean that every group would necessarily fit. But the problem is the way it stands right now, we don't know. It's not clear. And so when someone makes a terrible threat, I didn't feel, and many people in the room I think would agree, we didn't have anything to hold the person accountable. You know, we didn't have any way to convict a person for doing this type of thing.
So the proposed legislation is to define what is a group?
Well, it's broader, much broader than that. So we've actually proposed 2 separate laws. We've proposed a misdemeanor, which didn't exist because there are instances where a misdemeanor is appropriate as opposed to a felony. We've also proposed a felony where we are saying it's a group of people who are gathered. And we've given examples, but we've also indicated that it's not an exhaustive list. So it could be, for instance, a mall, a movie theater, a place of worship. Loose fitting, but there's more, you know, everyone, if you commit a crime, you should know what it is you're being charged with, and we should know what we're able to charge you with. So it just is much more structured. It's also when a person not only commits the threat, but directs someone else to commit the threat. You know, because unfortunately we see that happen as well, where I'm not the person doing it, but I gather a group of people and I ask them to go and do the threat. Well, I should also be held responsible for my actions of inciting this violence. So our legislation, there's a lot to it, but we're proposing a misdemeanor and a felony, which would help to define all of these things and give potential jurors the tools that they need to hold people accountable.
Let me point this out before I open up for questions, because I think it's important to put this in context. Generally speaking, if our laws are either overbroad or too narrowly tailored, something is going to get lost in the effectiveness of law enforcement specifically, but also in our community's response to the issue. So if we don't understand the terms that are defined by the law, if we don't understand what protections there are and what exceptions there are in our privacy laws, something's going to get lost in the effectiveness of law enforcement and our leadership's response to these issues. So we have proposed legislation, but the district attorney's proposed legislation, but not just that. We also have the task force required, and one of the requests that I had was that we add a glossary of terms so that there's clarity on what these terms mean, so that the member of the public who picks up this report will be able to understand what FERPA says and doesn't say, what the laws say and don't say, and what is now at the helm and what we're waiting to have proposed in terms of legislation to properly address the gaps in the law. Another example of what Melissa was sharing, and I'll ask Tammy just to chime in, the head of our appeals bureau is here. In 2017, a decision by our state appellate court prompted this threat of mass harm legislation that Melissa just summarized for you. Brian Hulson was a custodian at an East Norwich school who threatened to Columbine his workplace, a reference to the Colorado high school massacre that left 15 dead. He was arrested, charged with making a terroristic threat, which is the law that she just summarized for you, after a faculty member at the school heard him making that verbal threat towards a teacher and against the school at large. He also mimed or mimicked shooting a firearm while imitating gun noises, the police said, and arrested him for that charge. The appellate division, however, second department, said that the charge could trivialize the meaning of terrorism and no imminent risk existed, showing that he was going to follow through on this threat. His charges were dismissed. If we don't have adequate and specific legislation, laws, language in those laws to address these issues, we will have more cases dismissed. We will have more people feeling emboldened by the fact that the law is not addressing our law enforcement needs. And the fear is that we don't have a community that appropriately addresses this from every aspect of law enforcement, administration, having a house of worship equipped to understand what they can and can't do with regard to an individual who threatens them is important. And that's an important universal message, absolutely. You want to add anything to that?
Well, I could at least explain what the problem was in bringing the case, is that the individual, the custodian, had said to someone before a holiday weekend in a faculty lounge, when I get fired, I'm gonna Columbine this case. And the law required a type of threat that's imminent, that's I'm gonna do it right now, not I'm gonna do it in 3 days when I lose my job. So this person did have an arsenal of weapons where he lived, but under the law, the threat had to be imminent. He had to be ready to do it at that moment. And the havoc that it wrought on the school district and the staff and the people, and you know, it's not that the district attorney wants to just prosecute and punish everyone. She wants safe communities and people to feel safe and somebody to be able to go home into an apartment where they live with all these guns that they lawfully possess when they're threatening to kill students in schools, and yet we don't have anything to hold that person accountable. And so that's part of the reason why these laws really have to be drafted very specifically, but at the same time they have to be able to encompass the situations that haven't happened yet. Now we know, okay, now we don't need this kind of imminence, or we know what it is, and so we have to be broader thinking about what other circumstances haven't happened yet that we want to be able to cover, just so that we can start some proceedings, even if it's just to end up with appropriate treatment and prevention, not to necessarily just put someone in jail. And so the district attorney will always have flexibility when she brings charges as to what will be the outcome, but we can't even begin when the laws as they exist don't allow for any kind of legal action.
So what we ended up with, and I'll close here, are the issues that were presented to us by the district attorney. What are the inconsistencies? Where are the gaps in funding and support services? What are the misunderstandings with regard to our legislation and our laws? And in that, we've now come up with a set of best practices. And our best practices for law enforcement, our best practices for legislators, our best practices for administrators, students, parents, will be summarized in this report to address all of these needs as best we can. These are not the only practices. These are not the only protocols in place. When we spoke with the federal, state, and local law enforcers who are members of our task force, they each had a different set of guidelines that was presented by the Secret Service, that was presented by the state troopers, that was presented by Nassau County. When we culled together that information and came up with a set of agreed upon best practices, we now have something that we can recommend for the public to utilize, to be educated with, and to hopefully equip us to be a safer county. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions, and they can be open to anyone in the room. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about the task force. Are there people on it that are mental health providers in the hospitals? Because I see that you have mental health first aid training, and I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
Except what I do is that once we find that there's a need, and by the way, I'm an LCSW.
Oh, okay.
So you'll know there's a need, and then there's nothing you can do with that need.
Right.
There are not enough beds in local hospitals. I am coaching clients or parents what to say in order to be admitted, and it's not okay. So we might identify this human has issues, right?
Yeah.
And he needs help, and then we can't find the help. It's been identified, it's been stated, and then there is no help, and then you walk into a clinic, and we're like, okay, we'll give you an intake 3.5 weeks from now. So I guess my question is,
Yes, we did involve and invite at various points along the way mental health professionals, both in social services, social workers who are in school. We have, and forgive my memory, I'm just trying to find, we have the Yes Community Counseling Center, we have the Mental Health Association of Nassau County, and we've included, of course, Nassau County's Department of Human Services, which is kind of all-inclusive. We have the LGBT network, we have the Nassau Counselors Association. So these experts, basically, in counseling and mental health needs have brought to us that very same concern. And the biggest concern is if we are underfunded or we are not equipped to answer the needs that are present, what can be done by the community to support us? If I have one counselor in a school, for example, or one professional in a church who's equipped with a sense of social services and mental health services, what can be done when that one person is overwhelmed, overloaded, or not available? And to that, the kind of consensus was, we have to equip the community to know what the signs and symptoms are so that they can hopefully address the emergencies by bringing the person in crisis to our centers, or make sure that they are providing support and not ignoring the problems along the way. So it may not be counseling in the strictest sense. It may simply be a mom or dad asking, why did you post this on Instagram? What's going on? It may simply be a friend or family member asking that individual the questions that will lead to the help. The hope is that the help can support as many people who are in need. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay.
So are you addressing, I'm so sorry, I
Yeah, yeah.
have to follow up, but are you addressing, that's all great. So I'm a school social worker
Yes.
of 1,000 kids, there's me, you know. But are we addressing the lack, it's great that families are getting more, but the lack of resources within Nassau County, that our mental health facilities are shutting down, our day treatment centers are gone. Like, you know, I know that there's Brunswick, but they're kind of smaller and smaller, and I guess it's, if I ask me, is there gonna be funding? Yeah, is it gonna
Well,
be
that's the
funding?
second issue that we came up with. That's the second issue that we realized doesn't just touch our schools, but it touches our mental health service providers. The issue that I will present you with, though, is this. There are long-term solutions and short-term solutions. The long-term solution is to get the funding, the legislation, and things in place that will help us in 10 years. There are instant solutions that we need to put in place and put into a parent's hands so that they understand this is what my child looks like, and I need to make sure that my child gets the services that they need tonight. Because that funding that's going to be given to me through some legislative act or some bond is not going to come down and trickle down to my school or my center until 5 years from now. But right now, I have a kid in crisis, what can I do? So having those, just raising public awareness about the issue is going to go hopefully a much longer way than where we stand today.
No, I'm just listening to you, and I just heard recently on the that the rate of suicide has increased so much.
Yes.
And in linkage with suicide is homicide. And some kids might, internalize it and become suicidal. And in addition to the fact that some kids, I'm going to say high school kids, might be more homicidal, and this is what goes on, come in, shoot, I want to die, I want to take somebody with me. I mean, that kind of mentality. Where are the services? I mean, we work in Roosevelt. Where is our mental health facility for emergencies? I mean, it's hard for parents to get into a cab or wait for a bus and to take their child to an emergency room.
If they're willing.
Yes, if they're willing.
Long Island Crisis Center provides the mobile crisis van, right? We also have the emergency rooms for hospitals, which is not, those are not designed to be a mental health receiving facility. But in terms of the emergency or the crisis need, that's the best response. The 911 call should not only be resolved for crimes being committed, but if you have a person that's in mental health crisis, we need to make sure that first responders are there.
But I have to say, in front of all these people, I've called the mobile crisis team from Nassau County many, many times, and there's always resistance to come to Roosevelt. And I can't accept that. I have kids in crisis.
Right.
I can't go home and sleep quiet, peacefully if I know someone hasn't had that service.
Right. And we agree with you. And that's what, it brings me back to my point that there are longer term solutions that we need to put in place. We need to make sure that those services are enhanced, that the training is provided to those treatment providers who are listening to the hotline call, and that they understand how to assess the need properly, and that there's a uniform way of doing that across the county. Again, if they're understaffed and underfunded, that's a larger question that we can fix. But today, they are our best practice that's in place for us to access. I'm going to take questions offline. The lunch hour has begun. Thank you for your time and attention. And